Episode 252, Herbs. This is the Change Underground for the 12th of April 2021. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Quick reminder that the Change Underground is supporting the Bubugo Conservation Trust in Uganda through a percentage of the course sales and the Buy Me a Coffee link over at worldorganicnews.com. Link in the show notes. Now to today's episode, herbs. When we think of gardening, we generally think of veggies, but what if there were other options? Turns out there are, and as you can tell from today's episode title, herbs are one of the options. Why would we go down that route? Well, time might be an issue, a love of perennials might be too. Let's look at the perennial angle. Say we chose thyme, rosemary, sage and some mint as the key herbs we're interested in. These are all perennials and would not need reseeding each year. They could form the skeletal structure of garden beds around which we could plant annual herbs or veggies. The advantages of many, especially if you live in suburbia or even a flat with a balcony. For the flat, containers would be the obvious way to go. Apart from the permanence benefits of planting directly in the soil, all the other reasons for going this way will apply. In a suburban area, these plants could replace all the non-edible flowering species in a front garden, or be laid out in production spaces in the backyard. With the permanent plantings, of course, comes the development of mycorrhizal structures in the soil. Now these could be nurtured and the herbs left to flourish on the mycorrhizal systems. Each year they would develop much deeper, stronger rooting systems, building drought tolerance over time. Once established, either in pots or in the soil, other opportunities arise. Rosemary strikes from cuttings so regularly it could almost be a weed. That said, small cuttings raised for a few months could be worth around $5 in our local market, in little 5 to 10 centimetre pots, depending how long you grow them out for. Check where you are and do the maths, but this can be a viable side hustle, or for that matter, even a full-time income. Thyme and sage always strike relatively easy too, but not quite as strongly as rosemary. Little shrubs for sale again, for the entrepreneurially minded. The mints really can become weeds if you're not careful. There is, though, in many places a strong demand for mint. So strong I was surprised. My propagation teacher at TAFE College pointed out to me that his first job in the industry was propagating mint into 5 centimetre pots. That's about 2 inches. This consisted of him initially filling 10 plastic flat trays of 54 cells with 2-leaf cuttings in each cell, keeping these moist, and a week later when they'd reached the 4-leaf stage, pinching off the top 2 leaves and planting them into a new set of trays. The original was then left to grow for a couple of weeks, then planted out into the 5 centimetre pots and left to grow for another 4 weeks before being sold on to nurseries. And the cycle continued, continuously, ad infinitum. Where he was working, experimented with lemon balm, peppermint and chocolate mints, and a few others, but none of these ever sold as heavily as the standard mints. Eventually he was doing this job 5 days a week for half a day each day, with many more trays. Now he was based in a greenhouse with under-tray heating and automatic misting irrigation, and such a thing could be set up in a backyard situation once the market had been identified. The rural nursery sold the pots at $4 and bought them off the place he was working at for $1.50. If you grabbed the retail nursery price, you'd be on a winner. But even at the wholesale price, little mathematics reveals 54 cells by 10 trays equals 540 plants. At $1.50, that's $810 a week, or just over $42,000 a year. Which is not bad for a side hustle, maybe 3 or 4 hours labour a week. The number of cuttings and price per pot grower may vary where you are, but it would definitely be worth a look. The cost of the setup would need to be taken into account, but if you started in summer, the greenhouse polytunnel would not be a necessity to begin with. I'm sure similar numbers could be had for the other perennials mentioned, rosemary, sage and thyme. but the growing period would definitely be longer, and so you'd need to do more at a time. If we toss into the mix annual herbs, a full-time living starts to propose itself. Where I lived in the Blue Mountains, a couple used to hold 2 herb weekends a year, April and October. They grew the perennials we mentioned above and lots of annuals. Many of the ones they grew were used in medicinal herbal practice, which was a big thing in the mountains where we were. Their front yard was laid out with tables groaning under the weight of propagated cuttings and ready to use annuals. I clearly remember the basil disappearing early in the mornings. They also sold bunches of fresh parsley, mints and basil. And if I recall correctly, they grew about 15 different types of basil. Some 10 were the same each year, and they experimented with the other varieties over time. Some of the herbs they dehydrated and sold as dried herbs as well. I think they both had part-time jobs a few days a week from what I can remember, but the rest of their income came from these 2 herbal fairs, as they called them. Maybe one every season would make more sense, so that'd be 4 a year. I'm not entirely sure. It is a thing to consider if your local authority allows such home-based things. If not, you may need to go to a farmer's market or a retailer, and it's not the sort of thing I have a great knowledge or expertise in, but it could make a decent living, I think. And there would be nothing to stop you from having a garden bed or 2 of veggies for your own table in amongst it all. Indeed, writing this episode has me twitching to hit a spreadsheet and run some numbers. Now that the spelt oats, wheat and barley are in for the run through winter, a little light propagating does sound appealing. So give herbs a thought. Even if you only grow enough for your household, you'll be adding biodiversity to your gardens, and that's always a good thing. So if you have any questions, thoughts or suggestions, I've opened a new Facebook group. Just at the moment there's only myself in there, and I've called it, imaginatively, the Change Underground podcast group. You can search on Facebook for that, or there's a link in the show notes and in the transcript over at worldorganicnews.com/episode 252. And even in growing herbs, we can decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be back next week.